edition. Just as a reminder to everybody of the ground rules, this session is being recorded, so please keep that in mind when you ask questions. I would just ask you to ask clarifying questions throughout the presentation, but please save the more in-depth, like conceptual, like big picture kind of questions to the end. If you're participating via Zoom, you can ask questions two different ways. One way would just be to put your question in the chat. Dominique mentioned that she's comfortable enough with Zoom these days to watch the chat room, or you can raise your hand using the hand raise function in Zoom, and if either Dominique can reach you or I'll alert Dominique if she hasn't had a chance to notice. If you're viewing via YouTube, submit questions on Twitter via hashtag PIER seminar, or email PIER, PIER _fellowship at gse.harvard.edu, and Ashley will insert it into the chat. Now, after all the ground rules are set, I just wanted to extend a warm welcome to Dominique Baker. Dominique is Assistant Professor of Education Policy at the Annette Caldwell Simmons School of Education and Human Development at Southern Methodist University. She primarily investigates student financial aid, affirmative action, and admissions policies, and policies that influence the ability of colleges and universities to create an inclusive and equitable campus climate. Dominique, in 2021, won an early career award from the Association for Education, Finance, and Policy. Today, Dominique is going to be talking about evidence on the role of race and gerrymandering in the drawing of community college districts. So, Dominique, welcome to the PIER seminar.
Thank you all so much for having me. I will say, so my parents are watching on the YouTube version. And so when you said they could submit questions via hashtag, I was like, oh, we're safe, because they don't know how to do that. But then you said an email address. So Ashley, my apologies in advance if my parents randomly send you a question that's just like, but isn't Dominique amazing? Yeah, it's just, I mean, will probably
that is a clarifying question.
That is a clarify. How amazing is she? The only answer we accept is the most amazing. Yes. That would come from my father. But thank you so much for having me. So I am going to share my screen and make sure everything is set up well. Put that into full screen mode. Can y'all see that move? Perfect. Then I'm just popping open the chat and participants. And as Tom said, I taught all of last year online. And so I'm pretty comfortable with monitoring things. So hopefully we should be able to have a little bit of smooth sailing. So I am talking to you today about a current in progress piece of work. So I love feedback and thoughts as I continue to work with my co-authors on refining this. And so this is focused on the politics of community college districts, a national overview and implications for racial gerrymandering in Texas. And this is co-authored work with Bethany Edwards, Spencer Lambert, and Grace Randall, all students at Southern Methodist University. I have to throw up at the front this disclaimer that this work is in part based on or supported through the Spencer Foundation. So basically, if you get mad at anything in here, you want to email me, not the Spencer Foundation. This is all work that's reflecting our views and not theirs. So let's get into it. One day I was perusing Inside Higher Ed, as I'm wont to do, and I noticed this article called Messing with Texas. And it sort of says it all: gerrymandering in community colleges. And it was a piece that was looking at Texas community college districts and an argument that was happening in the legislature that year around moving some parcels of land into a different district. And that basically everyone agreed that the reason people wanted to move these areas was because there were wealthier people that lived there. And I read this and I just had to actually just pause and stop, because I was just like, wait, I'm sorry, I did not know that this happened in community colleges. I knew that there was a very strong literature about this in K-12, but I just had never quite thought through these types of political machinations within community colleges. And it's especially interesting and sort of piqued my interest when I started to look at Texas. So what you can see is sort of a heat map of the Texas service areas, and the darker, the more red an area is, the larger the number of people are served by that service area. And what you can sort of see is the darkest areas are around Fort Worth and Dallas and Austin and San Antonio and Houston and El Paso. And as I thought more about the construction of these service areas, what they look like, I was really curious to better understand just whether or not this gerrymandering that had been posited in a popular press piece actually had any sort of teeth to it. And so there's tons of K-12 research on this. I just picked 3 to highlight that talk about sort of, are these accidents of geography? Do we have irregular shapes here? What are these different geospatial methods that we can use? And what's really interesting and challenging about this is within the K-12 work, generally speaking, there are either 2 findings, and these findings either fall in the camp of the attendance zones for K-12 schools represent some sort of either income or racially based gerrymandering, and are significantly closer to the types of gerrymander we see in things like your legislative areas. Or, there's some here, but really what we think this is more tied to residential segregation. And it's not in and of itself the actual K-12 boundaries that are creating more segregation within schools, or less segregation, as it were. And so these tensions at play definitely influenced, as I thought about, well, what would this look like in higher education at community colleges? The tensions within what the prior literature says influenced a lot as the team started thinking about how would we want to study this in community colleges, because these different studies use slightly different definitions of schools, use slightly different analytic methods, which we can definitely talk more about as we go through, or later on, or you are welcome to email me if you want to talk even more about this. But we really wanted to learn from this, right? Like, it's not the fact that, oh, this is just a new complete idea that no one's ever done work on. There's a lot of people that have done great work on this. And so we wanted to be able to learn from what they've done to think about how we can analyze within a higher education space, especially since there's no clear answer within the K-12 literature to say, like, yes, the attendance zones are gerrymandered, or no, they're not. So I mentioned that there's sort of less research in higher education. What do I mean by less? I mean that there's no national repository tracking which states even have these policies. So just like starting from a base level, we do not have a list of states that say these are the ones that have some sort of attendance zone policy for community colleges and these don't. There's been little research that's focused on community college districts. And when it has, it's primarily the relationship between sort of the district and enrollment. So this can be something like Riley Acton's great work that focused on Michigan and looked to see that students who live in districts are more likely to enroll in the community college that's within their district. And she does a very convincing job of showing that this is a causal relationship. But it's important, I think, to note that while that research, we've got a couple of studies, but even not that many studies like that, what we really don't have is research that sort of takes another step back. thinking about these boundaries as sort of artifacts of a political process, right? We know that these boundaries didn't just sort of occur randomly in nature. People had a hand in crafting how these boundaries would be created, what role they would play within the enrollment process within higher education, all of those sorts of pieces. And so it felt really important to think about, well, what are these boundaries as political artifacts? So this current study seeks to sort of fill in on some of our understanding. And so we're looking at two questions here. One is, what is the political process underlying the creation of community college districts across the United States? And the second is, do the district boundaries of community colleges provide evidence of gerrymandering in Texas? And what I like to think of is, broadly speaking, if I was on an elevator with someone and they wanted to very quickly know what this project is about, I would say that it's understanding who the community is in community college. We talk about community colleges as these institutions that are supposed to be responsive to their local environment, that are supposed to be thinking about their coursework and their majors in relation to the people that live in it's sort of their neighborhood, right? If we think about it, well, this study is really trying to understand, how do we construct who is in that neighborhood, who is in the community that the community college is supposed to be supporting. So, and you can sort of think of that the first question is focused generally on the United States, trying to understand the context and sort of create really good deep background knowledge in order to then think about a case study within Texas. So I sort of try to make it a little bit simpler to follow. So I talk about both data for that first question, thinking about the United States, and data for the case study for Texas. I do the same thing for the analysis and the results. So first up, data for the United States. So we, a team member, went through and examined all states' constitutions, education codes, and sort of additional policy documents to create evidence around whether, to learn about whether or not there was evidence for districts within each state. And this was an iterative process where we selected a group of states, had more conversations, expanded out, and this was to allow us to better understand where our sources of information were likely to come from, instead of just diving in to all 50 at one time. Two team members, one of them is me, independently coded all of the states. And so we looked at a lot of different information, like, is there any sort of presence of a district? What do we know about them? What are they called? What are they based on? Is it cities? Is it highways? All sorts of things. How many are there within a state? Which political actors play a role in determining these boundaries? Do institutions provide a tuition discount for students who live within these areas? Because not all states have policies where there's a reduction in tuition if you live within a district. And so one of the things that I really enjoy about getting a chance to do a talk in a way that's like vastly different than doing a paper is you kind of get more of the behind the scenes of what happens with projects. So I will say, that this was a ton of work that we did, where basically we actually went into sort of for every state, this is the example for Texas, we would have a question like, does this state's community colleges have some type of service area? And then there was a listing for what the codes needed to be, a source link, and the category for where the source came from that we would include, which means that every single measure that we have some sort of documentation verifying that measure, which makes us feel a little bit more comfortable about it. And including that we would have missing information if we thought that it was appropriate that it needed to be what we decided was a -3 if a state did not have a policy, as an example. And so I, along with one of my co-authors, we met frequently to compare these codes, and we did not consider codes finalized until consensus was met on every one of those points. And then I had a very lovely, my inbox overflowed during the pandemic, in part because I contacted the state education sort of governing bodies or community college associations, sort of the advocacy group part, with questions that we had about different states. So sometimes we could get information from the education code that we knew there were districts, but we didn't know what the districts actually were. So therefore, we can't know what they're based on, whether it's cities or counties or what information those district boundaries are based on. And they had no map, right? So that's a time when I would email a state to try to better understand that. I also emailed every state that we did not seem to have any evidence that they had a policy. And that was incredibly important because it definitely turned out that there were states that that in fact, in one state's instance, I was on the phone with someone who's had a storied career in the state within higher education. And so they said, yeah, no, I can tell you what all the districts are. And I was like, that's great. Is there any chance that you could also, send me to some meeting minutes or things like that? Like, I've gotten very good at reading the meeting minutes of several like board meetings and things like that. And they said, oh, no, it's not, it's probably not written down anywhere. And I was like, oh, okay. Cause I really couldn't find it anywhere. And they said, welcome to blank. So, it was this nice snapshot into the fact that, states vary in how much they document these types of things. And so a lot of the contact time that I spent was really trying to make sure that if we said a state didn't have a policy, someone working in that state had told us that it didn't have a policy. And so this led to 38 states with evidence of a district and roughly 150 documents for those states showing information about how their districts were created, what they rely on, that type of stuff. And so at
the end, will you let us like do a vote to guess like who the blank was?
Oh my gosh, yes. Okay. You can both do a vote on who the blank was and then which state cursed me out, which was fun. Right. Yes.
And they're two different states?
They're two different states. I will say, so part of the fun with this project, right, is I really enjoyed getting a chance to talk to state policy leaders. Too often we don't get a chance to really get it, to just talk to people about like, this is the work that I'm doing. And a lot of policy leaders, right, would say, oh, that's so interesting. Because, I would ask a question like, does the legislature play a role in how you create your districts? And a state would say, wait, there are states that do that? And I would say, oh yeah, there's this state and that state. And they'd be like, I never would have thought that state would do that. And so it was a really enriching experience in that regard. Occasionally, some people were like, I don't know why you ever emailed me. This is a waste of state time, which is their prerogative. So yes, no, there's a world of fun across this. Let's just check. Okay. So then for the analysis, this is primarily descriptive comparisons, and the national part is going to be a little bit truncated for time. But again, if you have questions, you have feedback, thoughts, you all will have my email and I would love to hear them. So then thinking about the more specific case study, excuse me, we looked at collecting data on the 2017-18 district boundaries for the 82 Texas community colleges, which winds up being 50 different districts. And so this is an example of what that looks like. So in the legislative text, you will see a list of counties. It'll say, oh, a county, but not this independent school district or ISD. There are other ones that'll say it only includes this ISD, et cetera, et cetera. But we have this in writing for all of the 50 service areas. And so because of that, we are able to convert that text data into GIS data, looking at intersections of city boundaries, county boundaries, and school district boundaries. There are taxing district boundaries that are included as well, but the only ones that are included for this year of interest actually overlap with either an ISD or a city boundary, so we didn't have to worry about that. And so after we put the maps together, one of the sort of critical things that we did is the Texas Legislative Council sort of creates the legislative maps for the state of Texas. And so I was in contact with them to check and make sure that our maps seemed to make sense. And that was sort of critical also in contact with the Texas Association of Community Colleges. But those are really important parts because we wanted to make sure that as close to humanly possible, we were making maps of the correct things. Since so much of this analysis relies on the boundaries, if we're getting boundaries wrong, that's highly concerning. And I will emphasize here, this is not a legal assessment from the state of Texas, but generally speaking, we were told that our maps were correct. And so then we were able to merge that data with resident demographic information from the ACS, looking at 5-year estimates covering 2013 to 2017, and particularly pulling census block group information. And so for the analysis for Texas, it gets a little bit more into the Greek, as I like to think of it. So we were interested in measuring the indentation, so how smooth are the boundaries around districts, and then the dispersion, how dense are the districts. And so we did that in a couple of ways. And as I mentioned previously, a lot of the work that we did was really trying to think about what has K-12 research done, what can we learn from that, how can we apply that in this instance. And so actually 2 of the authors from the sort of primary prior K-12 work, Meredith Richards and Sal Saporito, were part of the advisory board that I created for this project. And so along the way, as we did this work, we were able to sort of consult with them to get their thoughts and ideas. And so I really appreciate their time and attention to this. But so first off, we did a Paulsby-Popper analysis. And so what that involves is comparing sort of the area of a district to its perimeter. And so this is the equation for that, but broadly speaking, it's really sort of around the idea that the best type of district is a circle. And for several reasons, we might not think that a circle is the best way to draw a district, especially when you think about a state like Texas, right? There are going to be areas of Texas that if you draw a circle, which I will actually show you in a couple of slides, it actually will cover the Gulf of Mexico. And so that might be from a sort of math standpoint, oh, the circle makes sense, but that can create some issues. So one of the other things that a lot of studies do is look at sort of REOC and convex hull analysis, sort of indexes. And basically both of these analysis measures, what they do is they create sort of an ideal shape that is based on what the actual district is. And the difference is the REOC creates a circle as an ideal shape, which is slightly different than the Paulsby-Popper, which is measuring the actual the actual perimeter of the actual service area. REOC says, let's create an ideal shape that is based on a circle that would encompass as much as possible of the district. The convex hull says, let's create an ideal shape of a convex polygon and let's see what we can do. And that's important because of sort of what I just said around the Gulf of Mexico as just one example, but also you're going to have circles that go into other states as well along your borders of Texas. And the basic idea behind these indices is that you look at sort of the population of the district. So sorry, I didn't say that D is the district. So you're looking at the population of the district and you're dividing that by the population of sort of your ideal shape. And so in both instances, when you do the Paulsby-Popper, which is looking at information about the district, or when you do the REOC or the convex hull, these indices will go from 0 to 1. And the idea is that closer to 0, means that there is a greater likelihood of gerrymandering, and closer to 1 is the opposite. So I said I would show you. So just to give an idea, because I think sometimes it's easier to see this, on the left is a REOC analysis and on the right is a convex hull analysis. So this is what I mean by an ideal shape is drawn to cover the district area, and then you can compare that ideal shape to the actual district. And so on the left, you can see that those are what if we made it with circles, and on the right, that is what if we made this with convex polygons. So on the right, you have much less encroaching, and I think you can see this. You see much less encroaching on the Gulf of Mexico, also just into Mexico or other states, in a way that when you do this with circles, there's a lot of area that is covered into other spaces. Just checking. Okay. So with this analysis, yes. Go for it, Peter.
Yeah. Dominique, How should we think about the areas of overlap? So to what extent, like, does that map onto some notion of like bias or underestimate or overestimate or something like that? And is it different if the overlapping is happening with another district in Texas versus happening with an adjacent state? It's more of an interpretation question.
No. That's a really good question. So generally speaking, folks do not focus on that overlap. Their primary interest is it's almost treating each district as independent and saying, what is the best possible shape for this district? Now, what is the best possible shape for this district? And looking to see a comparison between the two of them to see whether or not it's as compact as what the ideal shape would be. So typically looking at those types of overlaps is not a big part of this analysis, but I think that's a useful point, and part of why there are several reasons, but part of why I do the following analysis that's more demographically focused.
Yeah, because Betsy has a comment in here. I don't know if she wanted to make it that relates to this. Betsy, did you want to?
Sure. I was just mostly wondering if a citizen could then end up in two different districts, for example, like if they lived in one of those overlapping areas.
So great question. I think to keep in mind, like, because this is sort of a comparison, like, yes, there is definitely the case, like you all can probably see my cursor. And so if you look right where the cursor is moving, there are people that live in that area who are part of the comparison for two different districts because it's an overlapping area. So the thing to keep in mind is sort of like one person can be a part of the comparison for multiple districts. Cool. So as noted.
And so Dominique, the exercise you're going to do is not to say, oh, like these are the perfect boundaries. You're going to say, okay, if there weren't any other motives, that there shouldn't be a correlation between all of these boundaries are going to be imperfect, but there shouldn't be a correlation between district characteristics and the degree to which these boundaries mimic the actual boundaries. And if there is,
then we have more questions.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Yeah. So the fact that an individual citizen might be in more than one zone is not really going to affect that, that.
Yes, the fact that a resident could be in more than one comparison group.
Yeah.
Dominique, one suggestion is if you had some measure of the geography or the topography of the places, and you showed that under these polygons or the circles, that there isn't a correlation between this measure of geography and some attributes of the district, if you cut it that way, but then under the way that it's gerrymandered, there's a correlation between the geography and this, that could be another way. It's kind of like a quasi like falsification exercise or something like that, of that nature.
Thank you.
Dominique.
And
Tom will rule it in or out. What you just described makes total sense to me in an example of where gerrymandering, which is drawing congressional district boundaries, where like the people drawing the boundaries are completely free to draw the lines however they like, right?
Sorry,
Eric, you're cutting in. So
Eric, for some reason your voice just cut out for a little while there.
Sorry. Yeah, Dominique, could you just tell us the constraints that on forming these big understanding from what you were saying very early on was that like they have to annex particular municipalities.
Got it. So in Texas, they do not have to solely annex like a municipality. I was trying to give sort of examples of what frequently happens, but excuse me, that doesn't have to occur. It is the case that in Texas, a majority of boundaries, right, are based on some mix of, excuse me, counties, municipalities or cities, ISDs, and then taxing districts. So the big question is typically, in particular, when we start getting carve outs for cities and ISDs, sort of what is this whole that we're looking at? And is that in some way sort of different than what we might expect if we were just looking at the county or just look, right? Because there are a number of these service areas that do have sort of interesting carve outs, and not all service areas are contiguous. So some service areas include areas that, that are counties over and things of that nature.
But who gets to decide whether the decision is final? Like, does the
legislature in Texas?
Okay. So like, if I want to go grab a neighborhood that's part of somebody else's community college district, I can propose that, and the legislature has to agree to it.
Yes. Yes.
But nobody in that community has to agree to it.
Typically, the argument is that folks that are in the local community, right, have like petitioned their representative to do so, but they do not have a mechanism on their own to change what area which district they belong to in Texas.
Okay.
Which is not true across the United States. Okay, so then the other thing to try to keep in mind was this other type of analysis that looks at sort of a demographic analysis of the local environment. And what you sort of heard so far, right, is a lot of focusing on shapes, circles and polygons and all these different types of things. And so it would be interesting if in a world we could just sort of say, okay, well, like, let's look at, some unit within a district, like a census block group. And we're going to look at that group and we're just going to say, I don't know, the district has 300,000 people in it. So we just want to know, well, who are your 300,000 neighbors? Who are the closest 300,000 people to you? And I want to do it for all of the block groups in that area. And by that, I sort of create a local environment, the local group of people that live as close as possible to that block group that sort of mimics what the district is. And I could compare that group to the actual district to see how different is the local environment from the district that's actually been crafted. And so that's the intuition behind the following part. I try to give some numbers to make it easier to follow. It probably makes it less easy. But let's say that we pretend we have a district X, it's got 300,000 residents and 150 block groups. Then what I was interested in sort of doing was saying, let's identify the nearest 300,000 residents, because that's how big the district is, for every one of those 150 block groups. And we'll do this using ever wider concentric circles based on sort of the center of each block groups, the latitude and longitude of each block group. And that'll help sort of create a local environment. And then using that, I could create a sort of local environment level measure of the average percentage of each racial group. So the way that we look at that is, if you look at sort of what the Latinx local environment would be for District I, we're going to sort of do this work over all of the block groups in District I, right? So that will be in this example where I said there are 150 block groups, you're going to go from 1 to 150. And what we're going to do is say, okay, what's the number of Latinx residents in the local environment for block group 1? We're going to divide that by the total number of residents in the local environment for block group 1. So we're just getting the share of Latinx residents in that local environment. And then we're going to weight that by the number of residents in the block group and the number of total residents in the district, which was 300,000 when I was explaining it previously. We'll multiply that by 100, and then we will sum that all together to create a sort of local environment level percentage. And this is something that is based off of work from Sean Reardon and Sal Saporito, that is sort of trying to think more about who is actually living near each other instead of being so focused on shapes when it comes to thinking about gerrymandering. So once that gets calculated, then we can calculate the percentage point difference between the share of each racial group in the actual district and in the local environment. So a way to think about sort of like, what does that mean? If the percentage of Latinx individuals in the community college district was 70% and the percentage in the local environment was 70%, be a 0 percentage point difference. If it's 70 in the district and 60% in the local environment, that would be a 10 percentage point difference. So that means that positive differences mean that there are more of that group in the district than the local environment. So in the reverse, if we had 60% in the district and 70% in the local environment, that would be negative, and also theirs. So that would be saying that there are fewer of those individuals in the district compared to the local environment. So this is an additional way of trying to think about how districts are constructed and how they are similar or differ from their larger local environment. Cool. Were there any questions? Solid. So in the findings, first up, like I said, I'll truncate them a little bit for time, but thinking about that first research question across the United States, I mentioned that there are 38 states that had evidence of the policy. There was no clear regional pattern across the United States, but I thought I would give you some examples of what different like codes sort of said. So in Arkansas, it said that a community college means an institution of higher education established or to be established under the provisions of this chapter dedicated primarily to the educational needs of the service area. And this is like the typical type of language that we would frequently see, is that there's something about this service area or district that is driving the community college. Another example is from Colorado, where it said the mission of community colleges shall be to serve Colorado residents who reside in their service areas by offering a broad range of education programs. And so these, while they are implemented in slightly different ways, generally speaking, these policies and sort of legislative language are all fairly similar across the 38 states. And then there's wide variation across the country. So there's wide variation in terms, right? We call them districts, we call them service areas, we call them merged areas, we call them sponsor areas. There's wide variation in the political boundaries used in their creation. So you can have counties and K-12 schools and cities, but we also have things, I have talked to some states where they will say the river is on the east, and then to the south, the area gets cut off by the highway. And on the west, it's by this school or the city hall. So like very particular to that type of environment where it is not at all focused on counties and cities, other political boundaries. And then there are some where like one of my favorite states, for those of you who don't know, I already told someone this, but I am from the South. And so that means that Cracker Barrel is a very large part of my heritage and identity. We used to do family trips using the Cracker Barrel map and just following, and we only stopped at Cracker Barrels. And so with that, it really looks like somebody took a Cracker Barrel map and a highlighter, and they focused in and said, this is going to be that service area, this is going to be that service area, to determine how the areas were going to be made. And so there is just such variation when it comes to this. Some states have multiple levels of districts. So they have a general service area that determines majors and curriculum, but they also have a local taxing district that confers reductions in tuition. And those are not the same, and they don't cover the entire state. And so also tuition discounts, right? They vary widely, and the political actors involved. So in some states like Texas, it's the state legislature. In other states, the residents have final say. In other states, it's the governing board. In some states, it's county commissioners. So there's just incredible variation across the country, which for anyone out there who's interested in causal work means that like there are a lot of different ways that variation may be at play. And I think there could be very interesting questions that are answered based on these types of differences. So for the findings for Texas, I tried to mainly keep this to figures, but I do have some tables at the end if you would rather see some numbers. So one of the things I mentioned about using sort of these more shape-based measures, so the Paulsby-Popper, the convex hull, and the REAC measures, is that, you know, they're all sort of focused on shape. There's no clear message that like one is the one that you should focus on. And so I was sort of interested, and when I talked to the research team, they were also like, no, this seems to make a lot of sense, and thinking through what do we do if we look at all of these shape-based measures together. And so this is a figure that shows you, it's just a random mass number order, but shows you for any state that was in the bottom quartile for at least 2 of the measures. And so I just highlighted one so you can see that what this can look like is that the Paulsby-Popper is around, 1.9, that the REAC, which is the red diamond, is around a 0.3, and that the green square, which is the convex hull, is around like a 0.56. And the point behind this, right, is that like those differences and choices around shape matter. And because it's a little bit more challenging to know for certain which one is like, this is the measure that we should focus on, we try to work hard to say that like, these are some indications that some districts may have some concerns around gerrymandering, but we are by no means saying like, this is not a binary where you say like, that one is gerrymandered and that one is not. That's both not how other work can approach this, because there is no sort of threshold where you say like 0.5 is gerrymandered and underneath 0.5 is not. That just doesn't really exist. And so we are interested in sort of understanding what does the evidence say around building a case to say that certain areas are gerrymandered. And so there are 10 different districts based on these sort of shape-based measures that might indicate that there is some evidence for gerrymandering. When we flip and look at the more local environment demographic based, what you are looking at right now is the percentage point difference between the district and the local environment along the x-axis, and then the y-axis is just the frequency, and you see it for white, Latinx, Black, and Asian residents. I've also done this with other groups, but those differences are incredibly small. And what you can sort of take away is that the majority of districts are centered around 0. So there's very small differences between the actual district itself and its local environment, which is sort of what we'd hope to see if we are concerned about districts mimicking their larger local environment. In particular, the prior work has generally looked at around a 5 percentage point difference being sort of practically meaningful. And so you could see that there's, on the positive side, we get above a 5 percentage point difference for typically only white and Latinx residents. And right, like as a reminder, this positive means that the district has more white or Latinx residents than the local environment does. And when we're looking at negatives, we see that especially for Black and Asian residents, there's one district in particular, that we see that there's a little bit more of that negative percentage point difference, so that the district has fewer Black students in particular than the actual local environment does. And so generally speaking, we have found that there are 12 districts that appear to have these types of sort of size swings, and that generally speaking, we can sort of find where for like these down here, for the differential for Asian residents, Black residents, and Latinx residents, that there generally speaking is a commensurate difference in white residents in the positive direction. That is a thing that we're sort of still exploring, but that is our preliminary findings so far.
Dominique, could that be related to just the level of like density of neighborhood that Asian or Black
residents
live in, as opposed to like like if the rural community colleges and district, like, so if I look for the surrounding area, I'm more likely to see fewer people of the particular, ethnic group for Asians and Blacks, because they're much more likely to live in a
more urban environment.
Yeah.
So I think so I can definitely explore that a little bit more. I do think that some of the trade-offs we see, for example, between Dallas County and Collin County, that's not really a rural. Collin County is a suburban area off of Dallas, but it's not. The demographics don't exactly align the way that what you're talking about. It seems like there is a trade-off in white residents between the two. So it does seem that there is something beyond just the sort of urban rural part of this, but that is a thing that we can definitely explore more.
So Dominique, in the chat, Luke.
Yeah. So I was about to.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So an excellent question is, I said students, but the graph says residents. Yeah. No, these are definitely residents. That's the joy of studying higher ed. It's the same thing, right? Where like K-12 folks say kids all the time. So that is my bad. I misspoke. That these are residents. These are 100% residents. So this is from the census information on residents. I don't know if there's a follow-up. Okay. Yeah, so this is what we're still in the middle of trying to parse through. I mean, the conclusion for the US part, right, is mainly just like there's so much variation out there. There's and I guess we couldn't have said before this paper that there are 38 states that have this policy. And so there is a lot, I think, that's out there to be done around this. And especially, I think some of this, I was talking to one person about the fact that, this can have implications in a lot of different ways. Just as one example is, currently at the federal level, there's some conversations in a more concrete manners about what tuition-free community college might look like. And one of the big things that I was actually talking to some people about to make sure to clarify was some folks thought that in a state that has like an in-district tuition, that everyone who lives in the state belongs in some district that has in-district tuition. And that's not true. And the reason that matters, right, is when you're thinking about setting national policy for tuition-free college, if you say we're only going to fund you at the in-district rate, in certain states, but not everyone in the state lives in an in-district rate, then you're actually going to be underfunding certain students. And so that's one critical area where this has really relevant policy implications. And then, of course, there are state implications for the boundaries in Texas themselves as we continue to try to explore how those were drawn and designed. And then I thought I would do a really quick peek, and then I want all of your non-clarifying questions. That, like, future research, the goal is to have this data up publicly. And right, like I am a firm believer in the fact that like we have documented everything that we've done. And so it may be that potentially one person told us one thing and it actually works in another. And if we put it up publicly and someone tells us that, that's great. We want better data. We want to have as verifiable data as possible, but we also want this up so if we can, right, other people should be using this. There are tons of questions that for some reason I didn't include question marks, but like how are differences in political ownership of these policies relating to other political educational characteristics of the states? How do states decide to provide a tuition discount? How is that funded? Case studies of other states. Like there are just so many questions that other people I think can do with this information that I'm really excited to be able to share it with other people. And they can sort of do what they want with it. And this gets back to my misstep. So we're currently in the process of looking at the actual enrollment in institutions and seeing how that relates to these boundaries. And so just as a teaser, I have put together that these are for all community colleges in Texas. And you can see sort of going from 0 to 60. That's because there are sort of sets of 60 community colleges and IPEDS data. And it's ordered by their share of Latinx students. Excuse me, but you can see that there's wide variation in the share of students, and it in a lot of ways is similar when we look at sort of service areas and districts. So we're going to start digging more deeply into this and thinking about measures of segregation with actual enrollment to try to see how those could potentially link. Awesome. That's me. That's my email. Non-clarifying questions. Should I go ahead and stop sharing to see faces or?
Yes, please. So I see a number of hands raised, and I'm just going to go in order. So Matt Leonard, you had your hand raised until just a second ago.
I didn't have my hand raised. I was clapping, as were the others, but I'm happy to ask a question.
Sure. There you go.
Thank you, Dr. Baker. That was a fascinating examination and something that I've been thinking about a lot as a sort of a master class and good descriptive research that will lead to many more interesting quantitative questions. I wanted to ask about the relationship between political gerrymandering and gerrymandering around the community college context.
Yeah.
Whether you've thought about the deep history of gerrymandering, especially when it comes to southern states, Texas included.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have any thoughts about the possible, path dependency between legal gerrymandering and contemporary gerrymandering.
Yeah. So I will say I am probably not the best like pre-tenure person when it comes to like what I should do is like come up with an idea and then like do it very quickly, thoroughly, right? But quickly. Thoroughly for me is like reading a lot of books that probably I don't need to read, but I really want to dig deeper in. So, like one example, look, we're going to use this is like to do this project. One of my big things that I was looking at was the color of law, right? Because to me, there's no way to separate out thinking about political gerrymandering, thinking about racism in the country, and then thinking about this from a residential perspective without having a strong grasp on the history. Most of our ideas, right, they don't happen in a bubble. They are based on a lot of the things that have come previously, especially policy-based. And so because of that, I really wanted to immerse myself deeply in trying to think about these issues. And I spent a lot of time talking to a lot of just like pure sociologists and political scientists to try to better sort of engage with that. And so I think one of the things that's really interesting, at least in the Texas case, right, is that Texas's boundaries are based on other political boundaries. And so that's part of the interesting piece that like Eric and I were talking a little bit about is that in some places that is wholly not the case, but in Texas, since that is the case, what does it mean to have a county boundary that you crafted in order to keep certain racial groups living together versus other groups right? Like, what does that mean? What does that look like? That has a direct role to play when thinking about this within the Texas context.
Okay, Peter.
I will defer to one of the graduate students. So Mark, let me defer to Mark. You were the first graduate student. You can take my slot, Mark.
Hi, Dr. Baker. Thanks for the interesting presentation. Sorry if baby is a little bit.
Do not apologize. This is adorable.
We are multitasking right now. I would love to hear a little bit more about how the non-community colleges in the system in Texas sort of like play into your research here and sort of thoughts around gerrymandering and the boundaries.
Yeah, okay. And so this is what's really interesting in particular when trying to think about segregation within higher education, because it is both the case that we don't just have a single area, right? Like we have community colleges, we have four-year institutions, we have non-place-based for-profits, right? And so it's tricky when trying to think from a theoretical standpoint, what exactly does that mean? The way that we've tried to think about this is that we are interested in understanding where sort of anyone could attend as sort of their open access institution, especially because the legislature and sort of like the policymakers within higher education within the state have basically said that we want to make sure that we have a community college that is like serving people across the state. And so because of that, since there's this, there's a policy goal at play that these community colleges are supposed to be able to basically serve almost everyone in the state, that's why we're interested in focusing solely on community colleges instead of, for instance, also factoring in, Texas Tech and the UT system and the Texas A&M system. I also think a piece about this that matters is my play cousin, Rachel Baker. For those of y'all that don't know, the Bakers are very strong in the ed policy world. And so Rachel is an amazing scholar, but she has done a lot of work thinking about segregation within higher education. And one of the things she's actually done is looked across the sectors within a state to try to see where segregation is most concentrated. And it's actually the most concentrated at community colleges. And that it's typically, she posits that this is in part because of this sort of regional geographic piece.
So Eric and Peter, please stay in the queue, but I'm gonna call on Zach, another student with his hand up.
Thanks so much, Dr. Baker. So my question is related to the point that Eric raised earlier. So if I'm understanding what I read in the write-up of this correctly, it seems like there are carve-outs, but a lot of these things are based around like pre-existing county and city lines. So one question I had is, did you consider like how the carve-outs that they made compare on the measures you use to what you would have had if they had stuck to only using county and municipal lines? And then I have a quick question just about the in-district tuition discounts. I looked up just one case and I saw that for a particular college, it was like 3 times the cost if you're out of district. And I was curious if you knew like what the distribution of those discounts tends to be. Thanks.
Yeah, no. Okay, so first thing I've already forgotten. Sorry, what was your first question again?
So this idea of using county and municipal lines only. Yeah.
So we did do some exploration like broadly, but I don't think that we systematically did it. And so I think that would be really interesting to sort of systematically remove the carve outs and see how much sort of on these indices gerrymandering there would be. So I'm gonna jot that down.
And then district by district, just plot the difference, like in the amount of concentration in the county, and then using the actual.
So yeah, that's super useful. Thank you for that. And then the second one, so the differences can widely vary, but there are a number of states where 3 times as much is typical, because often it is not the case, right? Like the in-district rate is set by the district. So there's also variation, right? Like some districts can give a deeper discount than other districts are giving, and et cetera, et cetera. So it's variation upon variation upon variation for that. But yes, these are meaningful differences. These are not practically insignificant differences in how much the tuition costs. And I think there's a question from Twitter. So to start constructing local environments, do I use the block group that contains each community college? If not, how do I pick the latitude and longitude that these start in? Perfect question, Andrew. So what I do is I create a local environment for every block group. And so the latitude and longitude within each block group is then how it circles further and further out. So a single district will have several block groups within it. So block groups don't subsume districts, districts subsume block groups. That's great clarification.
Okay, so Peter, thank you for your patience and for deferring to the students.
Yeah, 100%. I would encourage other students with questions to please speak up and ask. This is a great opportunity. First off, Dominique, again, thanks for accepting our invitation to come to Harvard and to HGSE. This was a fantastic talk, a really great paper. I have a couple of comments and suggestions. I want to plus one what Zach said about the measurement. You can also think about like other types of measurement, like what if we aligned the service zones with like school attendance boundaries, for example, like for just like K through 12 schools, because these are natural alternatives that they can do. And you can just plot what the counterfactual looks like based on that. There's another suggestion from a measurement standpoint. So one of the things that you use is the in-district price versus the out-of-district price. It would be interesting if you could look at segregation based on income, right? Because you might see segregation based on income as being something that's relevant. You could also do income by race. You could also do income by race by age, looking at what the natural age range is for community colleges. So that might be one of the relevant measures of segregation. Like, are the people who the community colleges are intending to serve low income folks of a particular age, of a particular race, right? Are they systematically being denied access? You could also look at educational attainment within the census block too. So our places where educational attainment on average is low, are they being denied? And I would be surprised if we don't see more action there. In terms of the headline conclusion, I think another way that you could potentially sell your results is to say, look, on average, there doesn't seem to be gerrymandering, right? And compare the level of gerrymandering in this context to the level of gerrymandering in a political context. And in some sense, that could be like good news, right? So I think that could be a potential conclusion. And then in terms of the measures, I found the Reardon measure that you use to be very compelling. And so I think leading with that could be valuable because it's something that's very intuitive to grasp. It's just like a weighted measure of like how segregated the place is. Then with the polygon and the circular measures, one way to represent these could be to plot one measure against the next. And so we could effectively look at the correlation or the extent to which they line up. And if it turns out that your three measures are very well correlated, then you can effectively say, it doesn't matter how we measure this using the geography or the topology, the main conclusions are basically the same because they're highly correlated. And then that gets you away from having to choose a preferred one.
And unfortunately, they're not.
Okay.
that's part of the joy, right? Of that, like, so the ones that are based on circles, so the Polsby Popper and the Rioch are fairly correlated, and so that's a thing that potentially. But the convex hull is not strongly correlated with them, which is part of the challenge.
Okay. Well, at least that helps to simplify it down to just like a difference between these two different options. Yeah, so those are my comments. But again, like a really phenomenal talk. And I think this paper is really going to spawn a lot of other papers and it's very path-breaking. So thank you again for coming here.
Thank you.
Eric.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Well, am I still here? Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks again. So at the very beginning, you mentioned the news article about like, the reason that people wanted to annex these neighborhoods was that they were the rich neighborhoods, or maybe I'm making that up, but I think
no, that's right.
So one question, if you done it, or a suggestion if you haven't, would be to use to look at the outcome of home values or willingness to pay property taxes, to see if they're segregating based on that in sort of a, something like a taboo sense, right? Like reaching out and grabbing the valuable neighborhoods that aren't characteristic of my general local area. Or am I reaching out and grabbing the neighborhoods that may not be the property is not more valuable, but they're more willing to pay property taxes for educational amenities?
No, I appreciate, I'm jotting down notes. I appreciate that. Oh, we've got a question
from Monica Chan.
Yeah. So how often do Texas districts tend to change? Out of curiosity, do you think MSI designations could incentivize gerrymandering at all? Yes. Okay. So actually, that's one of the things I meant to bring up when Peter was saying that. So thank you so much, Monica. So first off, Texas districts have changed 18 times. And so it's fairly popping for them in a way that, like, some places, Iowa's have basically stayed the same since the 60s, 70s. So there is variation in how frequently these change. But the second part that I think is really important that Monica mentioned, and that I didn't do as good a job in the talk, but try to do a better job in the paper, is that gerrymandering isn't necessarily bad. We can imagine a world where policymakers say, we recognize that there's residential segregation and we are going to draw lines that try to help mix people more. And so it doesn't automatically mean that because there is a political manipulation of those lines, that it automatically exacerbates segregation. It could actually do the opposite and reduce segregation. Which is why, on its face, I don't think that automatically saying that some of these districts may exhibit gerrymandering, we don't necessarily know what the outcomes of that are. And that's sort of what we're trying to start exploring now. So thank you so much, Monica. That was perfect.
Great. So I just hope everybody will join me in thanking Dominique for joining us today. From Texas. And I wanted to thank and welcome everybody back to a new school year with the PIER seminar. Just a reminder, our next seminar is going to be on October 26th with Mike Kofid on experimental evidence on the impact of online learning in colleges, something that I'm sure everybody would be interested in after the last 18 months of lots of online learning. But in any case, thanks, Dominique, and thank you all for